Welcome to this week's Chinuch Hashkafa message. It's Parshas Eikev. Now, of course, in Parshas Eikev, there's the famous mitzvah, the mitzvah d'oraisa, of benching after we eat, ve'achalta ve'savata uve'irachtas Hashem alikecha. So here's an idea from the Gemara, which is connected to a very important and fundamental thing in chinuch, in parenting, and I think especially today. The Gemara has an interesting question. The Gemara says, the Gemara in Brachos, in two different places, but the Gemara, one of the ways the Gemara expresses is in the following way. The Gemara says, Ein li elo acharov. I know that you have to bench after we eat, but lefanov minayim. How do we know we have to make a bracha before we eat? And the Gemara says something very interesting, kal v'chomer. It's a kal v'chomer, it's how much more so, it's obvious, it's logical. If someone is satisfied, if they're full, and they make a bracha, when he's hungry, and he wants to distill his hunger, he wants to eat in order to not be hungry, like kol shekain, how much more so we have to bench. Now, of course, there's various ways to understand this Gemara. The Gemara has a discussion back and forth in two places, and the truth is that in conclusion, to bench after we eat is a bracha min haTorah, it's midoraisa, and to make brachas before is one of the things that come from the Rabbanon. It's a takana the Rabbanon that we should make brachas before we eat. But in this particular line of logic, in this particular line of the Gemara, I think there's a fundamental lesson that we should think about and share with our children, have a discussion with our children about. So, as a Dvar Torah, as a point of discussion by a Shabbos table, or when we take a walk, it's a good discussion to have, it's a good general knowledge to have about benching and brachas and the halachas of brachas, many things to discuss. But this particular message that the Gemara is telling us, I think lies the following principle. We often teach our children the concept of gratitude, hakoras hatov. Now, of course, benching, one of the ideas of benching is this idea of hakoras hatov to Hashem, to acknowledge that all our brachas come from Hashem. Hashem gave us the food, Berachas Hazon, Hashem gave us Eretz Yisrael, and so on and so forth. And then by extension, the concept of hakoras hatov generally we know is a very important thing. We tell our children to say thank you when they get something. It's good behavior, it's good manners, it's just a good way of living. The concept of highlighting the brachas that we have and expressing gratitude for them. But there's something else that is creeping into our society, and I think it's such an important thing to think about ourselves and to discuss with our children. And that's not just gratitude after we already get something, but it's not having the sense of entitlement. In other words, gratitude can happen when we acknowledge that someone gave us something and we say thank you. We acknowledge that Hashem He's the source of all brachas, and we say thank you. But we still have that sense of entitlement that we expected it to happen. Yes, we say thank you, we acknowledge, but we expected it to happen. We expect to have our meals every day. We expect to have the comfort every day. We expect, because we live in a life of so much abundance and comfort today, we just expect it to happen. And the Gemara is saying something very powerful. The Gemara is saying, when you satisfied, if you already had it, you have to bench. How much more so before you have it? As we know, the concept of brachas is almost like the Chazal tell us, if you don't make a bracha, it's like stealing from Hashem. Because it all belongs to Hashem. In other words, it's not a given that we're allowed to enjoy it. It's not a given that we're supposed to have it in the first place. And that goes for life in general. We live in a society today, and this is creeping into our children. And the problem with it is that it has far-reaching consequences. It is perhaps one of the reasons why when children grow up and they enter into relationships and marriages and so on and so forth, where sometimes there's so much trouble because we live in a world where we become self-centered. We just expect things to happen for us. We expect us to have all the comforts. And that's a huge problem. And maybe this is the concept, even the concept of making a bracha before we eat. Not after we eat, once we have it, we expect it to have it, but then, okay, we'll say thank you, we'll acknowledge, of course, that it all comes from the Eibishter, it all comes from Hashem. But it's more than that. The Gemara says, Kal v'chayr, how much more so before you eat? Don't just think that you're supposed to have it. Don't just think you're entitled to have what you have. stop with a bit of humility, a bit of thinking, a bit of reflection. Ask Hashem permission, so to speak. Acknowledge that the world actually belongs to Hashem, and it's not a given that you have to have everything. Of course, we daven for toiv hanira v'hanigla. We daven that Hashem should provide for us, and so on. But we have to get rid of that sense of entitlement. And of course, as parents, we have to reflect about our own sense of entitlement. Do we get frustrated if something doesn't go our way? Do we lose ourselves if the day doesn't turn out the way it's supposed to? If the comforts that we thought we were going to have doesn't turn out the way, do we show frustration? Or do we make the best of a day that doesn't go quite the way it should go? Or do we just talk about how everything comes from Hashem? Of course, again, we hope and we daven and we have bitochen, everything will turn out v'nigle. But it's that extra step of just expecting it to happen, having that sense of entitlement, which is so dangerous, but yet it's so prevalent in today's world. And I think it's a really important thing to discuss with our children. And perhaps the way to do it in this week's parsha is to discuss it the way it comes out of benching, but even more how it comes out from the Gemara. Incidentally, if you want to look up the Gemara, it's in Brachas Tach Mem Ches Amud Beis. How this concept of making a bracha before is a kal v'chomer. When we're hungry, we have to make a bracha, because we just can't expect that just because we're hungry there's food. We have to just be humble and thank Hashem for the blessings that He gives us. Have a good day and a good Shabbos.